Hello and welcome, my ghouls and goblins, to the Halloween series on the Screen Queen. Hello and welcome back, my little monsters, to Stephen King month here on the Screen Queen. This is your mini mistress of the dark, Sammy Parrish. So, I had no idea Cujo was actually more impactful than just being a rabid St. Bernard story. I thought this was going to be an episode I was going to cruise through because it's Cujo. No one really talks about Cujo except that it was written by Stephen King, and that was about it. When you have stories like a clown in a sewer going after kids, or alcoholic writers, or psychic kids, a rabid St. Bernard is not exactly on the criteria of horror. But this actually holds a special place in Stephen King's heart, as I found out. And I guess that's the thing about the saying, expect the unexpected, because you never know what is going to be the origin story of where everything comes from. And oh boy, did I find out a lot about this story that really made you think twice about watching Beethoven and this at the same time. So, let's get in our cars and go back to Derry, Maine, because this is Cujo. So, if you've never heard of the story of Cujo, I'm going to give you a quick synopsis, and I partially gave it away. It is about a town that is terrorized by a precious St. Bernard that didn't do anything wrong except get bit and contracted rabies, and now he's terrorizing the town. So, I have a thing about animals suddenly being the villain, because we all know that animals are only doing what they can to survive. So it's literally not Cujo's fault that something happened to him and that everyone didn't think to be like, it's gotta be rabies, right? You know, we can contain this. And yet Stephen King said, oh no, that will not be contained. But here's the thing that I didn't expect to find out about this. This is supposed to be a sequel to The Dead Zone. Yeah, the one about the guy who wakes up from a coma and has to kill Martin Sheen. That Dead Zone. I don't know how a rabid St. Bernard was supposed to connect to a psychic, but here we are. So here's the thing. It was supposed to be a possessed dog, and that is why Cujo goes on a terror, which sounds absolute batshit crazy, but it does make a slight bit sense if that's the angle to go along with what happened in the Dead Zone. So as I've been mentioning with Stephen King, when you look at his work, you have to look at who directs him. Well, sometimes you have to look at those eras of Stephen King from the man himself and where he was when he was making a lot of his material. A lot of his material, even the normal ones, have a weirdness to it. But then there was 80s Stephen King. There's just a certain flavor of what the fuck because of his intense drug and alcohol issues. It was so bad, Stephen King did not remember the ending he wrote for Cujo, even after it was published. The thing was in stores. He just knew, oh, well, everything was fine, everything was good, not knowing how much the alcoholism wrote that ending for him. Even though I'm sure it was everywhere, he could have picked up a copy, but he got sidelined in an interview when someone said, so how did you feel about having the boy killed at the very end of Cujo? And he was flabbergasted. And that's why he went to the director and said, you have full creative control to do whatever ending, just don't do the ending I did. That has got to count for something. If a writer is willing to give creative control to someone else to just say, please don't do what I did, make it better. That is a rare grace of control, especially from someone like Stephen King that doesn't always get his vision. This was one where he was like, go nuts, go nuts. Cujo, Maximum Overdrive, and It should definitely be examples as to why drugs and alcohol should never mix with Stephen King. But when they do, well, it looks like that. But what did it take to make Cujo? Because it looks like it's just one dog, even though we know with most animal productions, there's at least a few animals that look slightly similar, even though they mostly try to film it with the same animal. This one took 5 St. Bernards, 1 mechanical head, and 1 man in a dog costume. That was the entirety of Cujo, or should I say Cujos, plural. But during the production of Cujo, one of the Cujos did not make it. One of the dogs unfortunately passed away due to bloating issues, which could be caused by a multitude of things, like looking at that dog and the way it had to look like it had rabies. Whatever dyes they put or whatever was going on had unfortunately caused the dog to pass away. It's not great, but this is not the first time to hear about a production in the 80s, the 70s, 60s, and going early as 1940s that there was animals dying on set with whatever happened. And it was such a sweet boy too, because I also read this. All of the St. Bernards were so happy that most of them had to have their tails tied down, not horribly, but, you know, dog's tail is pretty fucking strong. Like, no matter what, that dog was gonna wag its tail, so some of the dogs did experience having sore tails or broken tails. They were just so happy in the production, even though they weren't supposed to look happy in the production. It's horrible. But that does lead me to Cujo's origin story of how we got this wild idea of making a rabid St. Bernard terrorize a town. Stephen King was getting his motorcycle worked on one day, and the mechanic's very aggressive dog intimidated him so much that he thought, what if it was a rabid St. Bernard? But it perturbed him so much with how intense the dog was that it was like, story idea. But unfortunately, because of Stephen King's choice to make this a St. Bernard, I think it goes without saying what that did for St. Bernards. There was not a high rate for St. Bernard adoptions because of the impact that Cujo had on a lot of viewers that still viewed a St. Bernard as a threat, which is terrible because there are so many animals that we deem to be threats or make to be threats when they're actually just doing what's natural for them to survive or a reaction to something like a sickness. Ugh. I get it. It's fictional. It happens. It was originally supposed to be a possessed dog, but this is the outcome of something that was from an alcoholic-induced idea from a mechanic's dog that led to St. Bernards not being able to be adopted. It wasn't until Beethoven came along in 1992 that was actually able to boost St. Bernards up and give them a better image. So think about that too. Cujo came out in 1983. Beethoven came out in 1992. That's 9 years. These poor St. Bernards were given a bad name. Okay, so I've been crapping on this movie a lot, even though it's Stephen King's absolute favorite adaptation of his own. Still can't get that sentence out. But there is one part of his favorite adaptation in this film that I can agree on. Dee Wallace is the best thing in here. So Dee Wallace was quite the scream queen back in the day. Like, she got a solidified status. Girl is still active in the scary genre. She has been going on different films since The Howling, Critters. She was the mom on E.T., which is definitely not a horror film, but she's the mom on E.T. I feel like I gotta mention that. It's the law. I usually think of her as the mom of the scream queens, because, you know, you gotta get it from somewhere. You gotta get it from your mama. And whenever she was in Critters and Cujo, like, Cujo by far is still the most praised of all of the horror films that she's done. Like, Critters, I feel like she was just the mom that was there, even though she had a very, very hilarious kill count that I didn't expect the mom to have in there. And then, well, The Howling, she was a reporter that was a victim of circumstance. But still, between all these films that she's done, she makes up a good part of the 80s in the horror department. That wouldn't be complete without her. You don't get too many scream queens like Dee Wallace, and her role is still praised to this day for playing the frantic parent that she portrays in here. Parents still walk up to her on the street and they'll say, your performance as that parent, you cussing out your husband and just rabidly going on him, that is what parenting is like. And she's like, exactly, because that's where it comes from, being a parent. But this was also one of the earliest productions with her husband, Christopher Stone, who has sadly been passed away for 30 years, but between the 80s and the 90s, they would find projects to work on together. It is quite hilarious that in this one, he's not playing her husband, funny enough, but they still got to work together and go into several horror films. One of the other ones that they went to do was The Howling, which came out a couple years after Cujo, and there's a very sweet story behind that, not to get derailed, but the daughter of Dee Wallace loves her mother's work so much and celebrates her father's life as an actor and all the installments that he's done, that she will accompany her mother to various anniversary screenings of her mother's movies. One of them was The Howling, and I'm sure Cujo is in there somewhere, but Dee Wallace is so celebrated as an actress and what she does. It's hard not to be intrigued by the moment you see her. There's not too many women that stick out in Stephen King genres, especially heroes, even though hero is kind of in quotations around her character. Still, she gave a character that I can see why Stephen King puts her at a high pedestal. There are a lot of Stephen King adaptations from 1976 until right freaking now, and out of all of those, it is still Dee Wallace and Kathy Bates. That's an impressive list. Absolutely worthy candidates, and they deserve to be on there, but man's got standards, and they're hard to break, apparently. I wonder if that list is ever going to change in the future to include more. Especially with the way that there's been some more Stephen King films coming through that have had stand-up performances. Mark Hamill, just saying. But on top of this being the film that derailed the St. Bernards and is one of the best Dee Wallace horror films and one of the most praised Stephen King films by Stephen King himself, this is also a film of first in another Stephen King reason. So earlier I mentioned that this was supposed to be a sequel to The Dead Zone, but this did become an Easter egg come to life. Come on, boys. So back in 1982, the year before Cujo came out, a little collaboration came out called Creepshow, which is actually the very first episode on the Scream Queen Halloween series. So just had to make a little mini shout out because not only is it my favorite, but it is one of the best Stephen King anthologies, in my opinion. And it's praised by so many. And in one of the segments called The Lonesome Death of Jordy Verrill, as the alien grass thing, parasite, whatever it is traveling out of his house, and it's unfortunately sprouting its way towards the town, there is a road sign that indicates different towns, and one of them says Castle Rock. And even though this takes place in Derry, Maine, one of the towns that Stephen King has said in the majority of his stories is Castle Rock. Cujo is the first story to fully immerse yourself in one of his towns before it eventually took on a life of its own. Before it got to be in the Dark Half, and you got to see Alan Pangborn. And then eventually Castle Rock got its own, unfortunately, limited series to explore more of Castle Rock. But we wouldn't have got there if Cujo didn't do it first. I would have never guessed that connection in a million years. And here we are. Even though this was an episode that I walked into thinking like, well, it's just Cujo. It was just that weird Stephen King movie from the 1980s, and learning that it's more than just that weird Stephen King movie from the 1980s. And I have to say, I think I enjoyed learning about Cujo than I did watching Cujo. It sounds mean to say it like that, but Cujo was made at a weird time where there was an intervention to prevent what Stephen King did, and when his alcoholism wrote the last bit of it, and it did what it could for its time period, and eventually it did lead to other things in the future that you can pinpoint that still connects Cujo to everything. In the end, it's still one of the many Stephen King movies, but since it existed in that time period when Stephen King was on everything under the sun, I mean, that's still a valid Stephen King to enjoy. It's not exactly Shawshank Redemption, but it's not exactly The Shining, but it's still something. Like I said, there's still many things to see that's great in it. Even Stephen King went on to say that this still holds the most best performance in his book by D. Wallace. So, like, even in the work that he claimed he can't remember, he's still loved in the end despite its faults. And I think that's still something to appreciate the way he appreciates it. So I guess Cujo wasn't all as rough as we thought it was. Okay, this is the best I got, but at least we're getting on home. So that is going to be a wrap for Cujo. That was a kind of a nice little way to wind down on Stephen King month. So for the Halloween series, we've done what is regarded as the best Stephen King miniseries, and we've covered a Stephen King remake, and we covered one of the Stephen King 80s movies. The finale for the Stephen King series will not be premiering next week, but it will be premiering on Halloween. And it'll be worth the wait, because this very episode is the reason why the Stephen King month was made on the Screen Queen. But if you want to catch up with me in between uploads, you can find me on my Instagram at the Queen of the Screen. And if you are looking for an easier way to listen to your Media Queen, you can find me on Spotify, on YouTube. There's many ways you can listen to your Media Queen. So I hope everyone is having a wonderful fall season. Stay safe out there. Just because you're crazy people out there, it means that we can be crazier, but please be safe while you're crazy out there, okay? Anyway, y'all stay safe and have a fun, festive, frightening fall, everybody. This is your Screen Queen signing off. Bye-bye!